We have some very exciting presenters, beginning with Dr. Karla Pena. I just awarded her her PhD. Karla is a PhD candidate at Cornell University. I just advanced her to candidacy. She got her master's degree at SNRE. And broadly speaking, she's interested in state-society relationships in Latin America. And her research here at Michigan, at least, when I knew her, when she was at Michigan as a graduate student, her research focused on Ecuador, much of it associated with the elaboration of Ecuador's food sovereignty law, which was new at that point. So, welcome, Karla. Come on.
It's really nice to be here. I remember taking a class here a couple years ago, and I'm really honored to be able to give this talk. I also want to give thanks to Eric. I was actually an intern at Food First back in 2007, where I was introduced to the concept of food sovereignty, and he asked me to write a paper on how social movements incorporated the concept of food sovereignty into the 2008 Constitution. And here I am giving a talk on. It's going to be on Ecuador, but also on Brazil and Wendy's work. So yeah, thank you so much, and thank you for attending the conference overall. So Wendy Wilford and I have been working together on issues related to food sovereignty. She works in Brazil, and I work in Ecuador. The talk we have prepared for today provides an examination of these two case studies within the broader context of contemporary Latin American politics. We make a fairly simple argument about who or what the sovereign is in regional demands for food sovereignty. This is not a historical perspective per se, as the title listed in the program for our talk suggests. Rather, it is an analytical argument about the way in which regional state-society relations in Latin America demand a rethinking of who or what the sovereign is in terms of food sovereignty. In the brief time we have for our talk today, we will suggest that the sovereign in Latin American food sovereignty efforts is neither the state nor the autonomous local community. Both of these actors, the state and the community, have been regularly romanticized in the literature. They are often either assumed to be autonomous and in control, or it is assumed that they need to be autonomous and in control if food sovereignty is to be achieved. And yet, an analysis of food security and food sovereignty efforts in Latin America over the past century suggests that the sovereign in food sovereignty is not the state or the community, but rather an articulation of the two. Regionally and historically, specific state-society relations, institutions, and actors have been central to promoting and enacting food sovereignty. To flesh out this broad argument, we divide our talk into three sections. First, we present a theory of the state that allows us to conceptualize the political system as a porous, flexible set of relationships rather than a predetermined set of institutions. Second, we examine the particular history of food production and consumption in Latin America, and how it's generated the need for and the importance of such state-society articulations. And third and finally, we briefly outline the experience of Brazil and Ecuador to illustrate the importance and analytical relevance of seeing the sovereign and food sovereignty as mutually constituted by both the state and society. To begin with the first point, the literature on Latin American state increasingly emphasizes a mutual formation of state and society. This is partly because of the dramatic shift in state-society relations over the past 2 decades. Beginning in the early 1980s, military dictatorships across the region were overturned by popular protests that ushered in the so-called third wave of democracy. New democracies from Argentina and Brazil to Bolivia strove to respond to popular demands for inclusion, even as they struggled with the legacies of import substitution industrialization and the burden of global economic crisis. The third wave of democracy became the neoliberal wave, as governments implemented radical policies for privatization, trade liberalization, and austerity. Resistance against these policies ushered in yet a new wave of progressive governments, referred as the pink tide, and what Wikipedia here has an elaborate description of what this pink tide is, which promised to attend to the popular demands for inclusion, representation, and distribution. Throughout this tumultuous period, new social movements have organized to pressure their governments for greater access and recognition. Although some of these movements retained the revolutionary or oppositional ideology and the rhetoric of the 1970s and early 1980s, many have been incorporated into formal governance structures, whether directly through elected and appointed positions or indirectly through consultation, mobilization, and partnership. It has been argued that state-society relations in Latin America have gone from a Leninist-style opposition or antagonism to a more negotiating Gramscian war position. This move towards negotiation results from what Evelino Dagnino calls the perverse confluence of democracy and neoliberalism, where growing political opportunity and representation combined with economic austerity are creating both the possibility of and the demand for an active civil society. As civil society organizations have grown stronger across the region, they have taken on more of the everyday work of governing. So charity organizations provide services once associated with the state, while social movements are tapped to target political beneficiaries, distribute state resources, and campaign for like-minded political candidates. The move towards participation and the incorporation of formerly radical and even oppositional elements into the state, both directly and indirectly, in Latin America has illuminated the increasingly soft nature of the boundaries between the state and society. As militants work on the streets and in state agencies, and as politicians appeal to popular movements and identify grassroots campaigns, the once clear separation between state and society becomes less obvious. This is perhaps nowhere as true than in the realm of food production, distribution, and consumption. It is here that states and social movements have come together to promote a range of alternative policies and programs that engage with food sovereignty. The high level of state-society collaboration in the arena of food provisioning in Latin America has to do with three key regional characteristics. So first, Latin America as a whole is not food insecure. The region has the most favorable trade balance in the world, having expanded agricultural production and productivity significantly over the past 30 years. Second, while food production levels are high, access is highly unequal. Latin America is characterized by extreme levels of inequality, with the highest rates of maldistribution of the world for income and land ownership. For almost 500 years, the region's abundant natural resources have been extracted and exported, consumed by the wealthy national and international elite. This stark juxtaposition of food availability social inequality has generated the third important regional characteristic, which is a high level of social movement mobilization in the area of food, particularly in relation to access to land and hunger alleviation. So Latin America is regularly referred to as the most organized and politically active region in the world, and this is particularly true in rural areas. Over the past 20 years, social movements have formed and gained membership and visibility both internally at the national level and externally at the international level. So we have the Zapatistas in southern Mexico, to indigenous movements in Ecuador, Bolivia, Chile, and Argentina, and Brazil, to farmer movements in Nicaragua, Honduras, and even in Argentina. And we also have anti-mining campaigns in Peru and Guatemala. The reason why these movements have formed in these places at this time has everything to do with the combination of colonial legacies of inequality and rural poverty, the weakening of authoritarian governments in the 1980s, and the almost immediate imposition of harsh austerity policies usually referred to as neoliberalism. It is this combination of high levels of social mobilization, food availability, and inequality that have generated such visible state-society articulations around food sovereignty in Latin America. There are excellent examples of this throughout the region, but for today, we're just going to focus on Brazil and Ecuador. Brazil exemplifies the contradictions of availability and access that we have just described for the region as a whole. Agricultural output and productivity in Brazil have increased rapidly over the past 30 years, making the country a world leader in several key commodities, from livestock to fruit and grains. But Brazilian society is incredibly unequal, with the second highest level in inequality in land ownership in the Western Hemisphere. Farms over 500 hectares make up only 2% of the total, but cover 56% of arable land. And it is these farms that have historically captured the majority of public support. In 2006, family farms supplied more than 70% of the domestic food consumption, but received only 25% of total agricultural credit. This inequality has manifested in the creation of two separate ministries, one for agribusiness and the other one for agrarian development, or the rural poor and small family farmers. The second one was created in 1999 as a direct result of social movement pressure, and it is this ministry that's tasked with overseeing food security in rural and urban areas. So you have food availability, but inequality, a situation that has engendered the formation of highly visible social movements such as the rural landless workers movement in Brazil. known as, by its Portuguese acronym as the MST. The MST was officially formed in 1984, and since then, the movement has played a key role in bringing issues of rural inequality and poverty to the forefront of the Brazilian political agenda. Although President Fernando Henrique Cardoso famously mocked land reform as a 19th century demand, the MST and the demand for state-led land distribution have become part of the national political culture of Brazil. The struggle for land reform in Brazil has generated new state-society collaborations such that it is now difficult to tell exactly where the state ends and the movement begins. A good example of this is the way the once radical land occupation has become, as often as not, business as usual. Land occupations are technically illegal, but in practice they are supported by state officials who have come to see the occupations as either a necessary evil or a normal part of the process. And although they were originally effective because they disrupted normal business, they are increasingly administrated as regular political business, with official forms and official mediators. So often when MST members carry out an occupation, their first order of business is to inform the media and state employees through what have become standard routes of communication. So as one MST leader said to Wendy back in 2010, and I quote, "First, we occupy, then we negotiate with INCRA. We send some sort of communication to our state office. It prepares a bulletin for the press. They send this to the authorities, and they let the people know about the occupation," end quote. While squatting, social movement leaders request resources from the government, usually in the form of the cestas básicas, a monthly food basket. This demand is not new, but is now so routine that in many states it's become institutionalized. Here are some pictures of land occupations in Brazil, and here are MST members occupying INCRA as well. And so INCRA is the national agency in charge of distributing land for agrarian reform in Brazil. So this institutionalization is not mandated by the federal government. Rather, it has been worked out in practice at the local level to save time and better manage the process. So when an occupation camp is created, the leaders of the encampment contact INCRA, and then they fill out a form and document the number of people who are actually going to be at this land occupation so that they have enough enough of the cestas básicas to fulfill their need. So INCRA personnel will then have this form validated, and then they take it to the regional agricultural supply station to be filled. So the system rarely works perfectly, but both state and social movements see the occupation as part of a larger political struggle around land distribution and settlement. Both state and social movement participate in this political struggle such that land distribution is clearly a goal that belongs to both state and society, not one or the other, as one might traditionally think of. The MSC has also pressured the Brazilian state to address issues of maldistribution and hunger in ways that bring together state and society and new institutional articulations. Lula's signature program, Zero Hunger, is a good example. Over the past 10 years, Zero Hunger has improved access to food, contributed to income generation and rural employment, supported family agriculture, and encouraged social inclusion and participatory democracy. One of the key pieces of Zero Hunger is the National Food Security Council, which is known as CONSEA. CONSEA is an instrumental national forum for advocacy and design of progressive policies oriented around food access and the importance of family farms. The council is composed of governmental actors such as the National Secretariat for Food Security, as well as numerous civil society actors such as indigenous organizations and social movements, including the strong presence of the MST. The backbone of Zero Hunger is the National Food and Nutritional Security Plan, which is specifically designed to strengthen sustainable agroecological systems and the role of family farm production in feeding the country. With strong support from the government and social movements, the National Food and Nutritional Security Plan has actively promoted respect for social movement goals such as food sovereignty and the guarantee of the human right to adequate food, including also the access to water. Neither land reform nor food sovereignty programming in Brazil would have been possible without state and civil society working together, both to create programs and then to oversee their execution. Social movements like the MST accompany the government at multiple levels, from the community to the municipality to the federal, to ensure that policies are executed and programs are carried out. They work within the government and push from the outside. As such, the lines between inside and outside are increasingly blurred. So now I want to move to the case of Ecuador, which I'm more familiar with. And Ecuador also illustrates the contradictions of availability and access outlined earlier. So Ecuador has a population of over 15 million. Nearly 1/3 of the population live in rural areas, with about 70% of the rural population employed in either agriculture, livestock, or hunting. Rural areas also have the highest incidence of chronic malnutrition and poverty levels. Land inequality in Ecuador stems from the post-colonial land tenancy systems, which tied huasipungueros, which were peasants, to the hacienda economy by compelling them to provide labor in exchange for small subsistence plots. Food sovereignty emerges in Ecuador from the combination of land inequality and the indigenous and peasant movements who have sought to gain access to the land and territorial rights they were promised in the mid-20th century. As in Brazil, social movements in Ecuador have pressured the government to implement policy. They are known for ousting 3 presidents, for forming the first indigenous political party, and they are also known for successfully pressuring the state to incorporate the recognition of indigenous rights in the 1998 Constitution, and also the indigenous cosmovision of summa causa and food sovereignty in the 2008 Constitution. The making of the 2008 Constitution was a critical historical conjuncture for social movements in Ecuador. The process was decentralized and participatory, allowing social movements to participate directly in the process of writing the Constitution. This had a direct impact on institutionalizing the principles of food sovereignty. In 2009, the Food Sovereignty Law was approved to provide a general framework for food sovereignty, and to further develop this framework, the Food Sovereignty Law created the state agency COPISA, which stands for the Plurinational and Intercultural Conference for Food Sovereignty. COPISA was and still is responsible for drafting 9 laws that pertain to food sovereignty. And these laws are supposed to cover an array of public policies such as land and territorial rights, agroecology, artisanal fishing, and the conservation of coastal mangroves. These laws are specifically targeted for small-scale farmers and producers. To draft the laws, between 2010 and 2012, COPISA facilitated participatory policymaking workshops around the country. And this is just an example of COPISA and how it works with state and non-state actors. So the COPISA workshops are a good illustration of the evolving synergistic relationship between civil society and the state for the advancement of food sovereignty politics. COPISA itself is a state agency housed under the Ministry of Agriculture, but the workshop facilitators, the conferencistas as they were called, were members of the national peasant and indigenous movements of Ecuador. By leveraging their social capital and social movement affiliations while working by the state, the conferencistas secured interest and participants for the workshops. A variety of civil society organizations participated in these workshops. Organizations that represented small and medium-scale farmers, labor unions, women and fishermen, representatives of local governments and state agencies, national and international NGOs, and social movement organizations also participated in these workshops. Throughout this process, the COPISA workshops became spaces of participatory and deliberative democracy. They expanded opportunities for common citizens to take part in government decision-making processes and policy formation. The workshops allowed disadvantaged and marginalized groups of people to participate in policy formation for the first time in Ecuadorian history. Many individuals I spoke to were skeptical about the impact their participation would have on concrete outcomes, but they still believed it was an important shift in Ecuadorian politics. A shift from exclusion towards participation and inclusivity. 2 participants I talked to walked 4 hours to participate in a workshop. It was the first time they had heard about food sovereignty and the first time they participated in a policymaking workshop. One participant said to me, and I quote, "I learned about the workshop through the Sucumbíos radio in the morning where the compañero Pedro Quimbiamba, which was a conferencista of the workshop, talked about this workshop and about the banks providing loans for the agricultural sector. I was interested, so I came. I came to listen to see if there was anything good." End quote. Another person had participated in multiple workshops, and he said, and I quote, "I returned to see how the law is coming along because it is about improving the livelihoods of farmers. I came to see how we can discuss and come to an agreement about how to defend the rights of the agricultural sector because it is one of the sectors that has been most suppressed." End quote. So between 2010 and 2012, COPISA workshops included over 15,000 individual participants and 5,000 organizations and state institutions. Although to date, neither the National Assembly nor the President have approved any of the laws, the process of drafting them has given rise to new articulations of state and society that simultaneously lend legitimacy to the state while strengthening the social movement organizations. These 9 laws under the general rubric of food sovereignty are not drafted by the state or by civil society. Rather, they are deliberately co-constituted. So we don't make any claims as to whether these state-society articulations are good or bad. Rather, we simply suggest that they demonstrate the rise of a new kind of sovereign and sovereignty in Ecuador. In conclusion, food sovereignty in both Brazil and Ecuador is a political project based in long-term regional and historical specificities. It is a concept, theory, and practice that is constituted by, even as it is constituted of, new social-political relations. In practical terms, this state-society articulation is represented by the relationship between social movements and INCRA and the case study of COPISA in Ecuador. But at a more abstract level, this articulation is actually producing a new kind of state-society subject, one that could be called the sovereign within food sovereignty. Thank you.
Plenty of time for questions.
Karla, I'm just curious, in that slide you showed of the different types of participation in the drafting of the food sovereignty law course. There's one with international actors that participated, and we have quite a spectrum there.
Yes.
From USAID to FIAN International. I'm not surprised to see Oxfam there along near USAID, but I am surprised to see FIAN and Heifer. Can you talk a little bit about that, how that worked? I mean, and also just the idea that international non-governmental organizations would be consulting on a national law.
So, my view, at least when I was doing my research, it wasn't so much that they were consulting, but more so providing resources to facilitate the workshops and also to provide resources to print materials or spaces. I think most of the consultation came from COPISA, but also the relationship to the National Assembly. So once people participate in these workshops, COPISA actually takes, for example, people write posters of what they think this new land law should have. And so COPISA compiles it, makes a law out of it, and then gives it to the National Assembly. Now, I think 2 of the 9 laws that were created in this process are sitting in the National Assembly. But in terms of the influence that international organizations have, I think it's very limited. At least in my perspective, it seemed like it was really a bottom-up approach. International organizations were really included just, in support of COPISA itself. COPISA was very limited in funding in terms of how to facilitate these workshops. So, for instance, as the facilitators were members of these national and peasant movements, they would call a local representative of a community just to secure a location. They didn't even have money for a location, so they had to call a representative of a local community-based organization to have a space to actually have these workshops, but also participants for the workshops themselves.
Anna?
Sure. Thank you. It was a fantastic talk, and I think it's really helpful to sort of dig into what these concepts of sovereignty really mean, which mean a lot of things to different people. And the question that I had, which a little bit stems on Eric's question about the relationship to the international sphere, a lot of what I've understood of food sovereignty movements is it's been an assertion of sovereignty against a perceived threat. So the ability of a country to set its own laws, against the context of the WTO, or the ability of a community to protect its territory against encroachment from land grabbing from a transnational corporation. So I like this co-constitution idea, but I'm just curious who is not included in that co-constitution? What would be the relationship of that co-constituted sovereignty vis-a-vis an external other, whether that be a transnational corporation or a global regulatory context?
So these, in my fieldwork, you don't really see large-scale producers participating in these workshops or with COPISA at all. These laws are specifically targeted to small-scale producers and farmers and artisanal fishermen, and so those are the people who I saw participate in the workshops. Now, maybe behind closed doors, maybe at the national level in the National Assembly, perhaps we might see those different actors there maybe influencing the outcome of the new land law, for instance, that's being debated, but at least in this whole process itself, you don't see those actors. So you don't see corporations coming in to participate in the workshops.
Okay, I have a question here, and then Peter, and then Annette, and then Leslie.
So many questions.
Could you explain further about how the facilitators are trained or elected or selected or
So,
the process?
right, so the food sovereignty law, at least one of the outcomes of the food sovereignty law was creating this agency where it said that the 9 facilitators or the administrators of COPISA should represent at least one sector or social group. And so a lot of the people, they have, there was one, for instance, that was a lawyer, but he worked a lot with fisheries, or at least with fishermen. So then he was in charge of making the law that pertained to artisanal fishing and mangrove conservation. In terms of their actual training, a lot of them worked with NGOs and or with the social movements themselves. And so the way that the workshops were facilitated, it was basically an 8-hour workshop throughout the week. And once, they're usually during the week, not too much on the weekend. And it's basically, you know, the facilitator introducing what the food sovereignty law is, what are they supposed to do, and then people getting into small groups like you see here and talking about a given theme. And people just really address this theme. But in terms of their more formal training, some of them might have college degrees, some of them may not. But it went through a formal process of hiring them as well. And there's a whole criteria in terms of how they were hired. And the law does sort of detail how that process should go about.
Peter?
Well, I think the same story could lend itself to a more negative interpretation, that the state is luring the social movements into endless demobilizing dialogues for laws that they have no intention of passing or implementing, and if they do so in ways that are like a trap, like the Brazilian government opening the food acquisition and then jailing peasant leaders for turning in the wrong number of onions and carrots, or in Ecuador, the government bashing CONAI and then tearing apart Fenocin because they differed on some of the issues in the laws. So I don't know if I see it as quite such a positive light. I remember one of the former leaders of Fenocin, who was thrown out of Fenocin by the state that they supported intervening inside the organization, said that we went from the euphoria of the Constitutional Party and celebration to the hangover of the state not implementing anything on the paper and bashing the organization. So I'm wondering how you would react to the possible more negative interpretation.
Of course. One, I think the relationship between social movements and the state is dialectical. So at one point, we'll see a high moment in social movements and them actually creating COPISA and these laws, and then in another moment, we're like, what happened? These laws haven't been approved, it's 2015. But I think that, at least the way that I like to think about COPISA is like the indirect or unintentional effects of this. So for instance, a lot of the people, when I would participate at these workshops, you have people who have never met before that live in the same community. And this workshop would bring them together and they're like, oh yeah, you do this, oh I do that. And so at least in terms of the unintentional effect of COPISA and just the broad term of food sovereignty in Ecuador, it's actually built a lot of coalitions in social movements. So I think that's really important to highlight. Although yeah, it's creating more bureaucracy. I mean, so what if we have another law if it's not put into practice? But that also brings in another important question is how do we even measure food sovereignty? How can we even think about what it looks like in practice? Are we looking at it at the national scale, at the local scale? And I think in Ecuador, we have these national laws, we have it in the 2008 Constitution, but how do we even think about how it's put into practice? And I think that in Ecuador, people know what it is, but they don't really know what it is in that sense. You know, food sovereignty can mean a lot of different things to people. And so I think that food sovereignty is happening in Ecuador, but we have to really look at that local scale and how people interpret food sovereignty given that context.
Well, I think this is a really, really interesting example of what food sovereignty is really all about. And that is, you know...
Speak a little louder. Could you,
sorry.
maybe just stand up.
Do you want the microphone?
Yeah, that's what
I'm sorry, just go.
Yeah. Well, I think it's a really good example of what food sovereignty is all about. And food sovereignty is about challenging existing relations of power. And in this case, and as in most cases, the power relations existing between states and social movements. So on that front, this is a really good example. I mean, but food sovereignty has always been about, I think all of us would agree, based on the work we've been doing, that it's primarily concerned about redefining the state, redefining the role of the state, its institutions, how it functions, and its practices. So, if that's the case, what we're seeing here is food sovereignty interrupted. And I guess I'm wondering how, in the case of Ecuador especially, how are the social movements involved responding now? Once they've engaged in this long, serious, and sure, conflictive process or processes of participation, which in some ways I think might be what Peter talks about, which is the adverse inclusion, adverse inclusion. And so how are they imagining their way out of this now? Like where are they at? Are they super mobilized, demoralized, or are they seeing more potential now after this exercise?
It's a really good question. I'll probably know more about it next week when I go to Ecuador. But for now, social movements in Ecuador work within, and against the state. So, at one moment they know that this is happening, and they know that, maybe none of the laws will be approved. But I think the one hope that they have is a new land law that's being debated right now in the National Assembly. And that's sort of my next project is looking at, who's participating and what's happening now. Because it's really hard to tell, what the national movements have in terms of their agenda, strategy, and trying to figure out how do we move agrarian reform forward. So it's really hard to tell, but I think that social movements are not demobilized, even though a lot of the literature says, because I think that they're always active and they're just always waiting for, what is that new issue or grievance that we want to tackle. And food sovereignty has been on the agenda the past 5-10 years in Ecuador. So I'm hopeful that things will change, but it's really hard to tell right now what the agenda is for next year. And so.
Dr. Hoy?
I'm just kind of building on the same ideas that Annette and Peter were talking about, and I wanted to say that this kind of work I think is really important because a lot of times Ecuador, Bolivia where I work, Nepal, other places are often hailed as, we have food sovereignty in the Constitution, but when you really look to see what's going on the ground, I think sometimes some of these, at least President Evo Morales has kind of taken that as something that he can claim, but when you really see what's going on, not much is going on, and sometimes it's very contradictory or anti-food sovereignty. So I'm also excited to hear also about the indirect, effect that this may have had, because at least it sounds like in Ecuador, I'm hopeful that there at least it was more participatory to come up with the law in the first place, and that in itself may have mobilized and even brought more people into the conversation than may have been already thinking about food sovereignty, that I don't think we're necessarily seeing in Bolivia. So I'll keep watch and see what you learn as you keep going forward.
Any final questions? Well, thank you, Karla.